The story begins deep in the mountains, where the air feels older than time itself and the trees seem to whisper secrets no one dares repeat. There, beyond the paved roads and forgotten highways, lies a place that doesn't appear on any modern map, a town swallowed by its own silence. Locals speak of it only when drunk or delirious, and even then, their voices tremble. For buried in that soil is a truth so monstrous it was erased from every public record, sealed by officials who swore the world wasn't ready to know. But some stories have a way of clawing their way back from the dirt. It began with a woman named Clara, the last living daughter of a bloodline already collapsing under the weight of its own sins. When she gave birth to her son, she didn't know she had just delivered her own undoing, or that the boy would grow to embody the darkest inheritance imaginable. He had eyes too old for his years, a voice that made people uneasy, and a face that mirrored hers so perfectly it seemed nature itself was mocking them. The townsfolk avoided the house after sundown. They said lights flickered even when there was no power. They said the boy spoke to the dead. But what they didn't know, or pretended not to, was that inside that decaying farmhouse, a love forbidden by every law of God and man was taking root. By the time anyone dared to intervene, it was too late. The papers called it a tragedy. The government called it an anomaly. But those who lived through it called it something else entirely, the curse that America buried alive. It began when a freelance journalist, hungry for a forgotten story, stumbled upon a name that didn't appear in any archive, a place whispered about but never officially recorded. He had been tracing abandoned towns across Appalachia, searching for remnants of old mining settlements swallowed by time, when a local bartender mentioned a road that wasn't supposed to exist. The man's curiosity became obsession as he followed faded maps, cross-referenced historical records, and found a single, cryptic mention of a town established in the late 1800s but struck from census data in the 1950s. No coordinates, no population, just a redacted line. The omission itself was a story waiting to be told. After weeks of searching, he located what remained of the road leading there, a cracked dirt path overgrown with vines, surrounded by woods so dense they seemed to breathe. Every mile forward felt like a step backward in time. The air grew colder, the silence heavier. Even his car's GPS went blank, as if refusing to acknowledge where he was heading. The locals in nearby counties warned him not to go too far, saying the last man who tried never came back the same. But the journalist, driven by equal parts ambition and disbelief, pressed on. When he finally arrived, it wasn't much of a town at all, more like a ghost breathing through the bones of old houses. Wooden shacks leaned against each other like drunks trying not to fall. The paint on the church had peeled into scabs, and the graveyard behind it was so overrun with weeds that the stones appeared to be sinking into the earth. Yet what struck him most wasn't what he saw but what he didn't. There were no sounds of life, no children playing, no animals in sight. And yet he could feel eyes on him from behind boarded windows. He soon learned that people did live there, or something close to it. When he finally met them, their faces carried an uncanny similarity, as if every feature had been recycled through generations. Eyes too close together, skin oddly pale, jaws slightly misaligned. At first he thought it was just coincidence, the result of isolation. But as he spent more time in the town, he began to notice something deeper, names repeating through the cemetery, identical surnames on every mailbox, and a strange pride in their shared bloodline. It was a place untouched by the outside world for so long that even time seemed reluctant to enter. What the journalist didn't yet understand was that he had walked into a living secret, a community built on silence and bound by something far darker than tradition. In the heart of that forgotten settlement, inside a sagging farmhouse cloaked in mist, a woman named Clara went into labor one rain-soaked night. The wind howled through the gaps in the wooden walls, and the lanterns flickered like trembling witnesses. No doctor came, no midwife dared to travel that far after dark, so the birth was guided by her aging mother, who had delivered every child in their cursed lineage. The cries that broke the silence that night weren't just of pain but of something primal and wrong, a life forced into existence against the laws of both nature and sanity. Outside, thunder rolled through the valley, and inside, a secret was born that would one day bring the entire bloodline to ruin. The boy arrived pale and silent, his small body trembling as though it already knew the sin that created him. The old woman's hands shook as she cut the cord, whispering a prayer that had no words left in it. Clara held the child to her chest and looked into his face, seeing not a stranger but something hauntingly familiar, the unmistakable reflection of her own blood, twice over. His eyes mirrored hers, but deeper, darker, carrying the ghost of another man, one who had long since crossed the line between father and lover. No one outside that house was told the truth of his conception. The story that spread was simple: the father had gone missing in a storm, and the child was born of tragedy. But in that house, surrounded by whispers and guilt, the truth sat like a rot no one could scrub away. As the boy grew, his resemblance to Clara's father became harder to ignore. The townsfolk, who already distrusted what they couldn't understand, began avoiding them entirely. Mothers pulled their children from the path whenever Clara passed by, clutching their hands as if her very shadow might curse them. Even the preacher refused to baptize the baby, saying his bloodline was already beyond saving. At night, when the wind carried the sound of crying from the old farmhouse, no one went near. They all pretended not to hear. Clara raised the boy alone, haunted by the memory of how he came to be. She tried to love him as any mother would, but there were nights she couldn't meet his gaze without feeling her stomach twist. Every smile, every laugh, every innocent question reminded her of the sin carved into their blood. The boy's birth had not just created a child, it had revived a curse that the town had buried for generations. And though no one dared to speak it aloud, every soul who knew the truth understood one thing: that child was never meant to exist. When the boy was born and the whispers began to spread through the hollow, the town's preacher took it upon himself to contain what he called the sickness of talk. He was an old man with a hollow stare, the kind who believed that silence could bury sin deeper than the grave. He gathered the townsfolk inside the church one fog-drenched evening, the candles flickering weakly against the cracked walls, and told them that speaking of the boy's bloodline was an offense against God. The preacher's voice carried an authority that came from fear, not faith, and by the end of the sermon, every head in the room was bowed in uneasy obedience. They were to say nothing, not to outsiders, not even to each other. The truth would remain locked behind their lips like a secret too poisonous to breathe. The preacher reminded them of what had happened the last time outsiders came years earlier, when the government threatened to dismantle their land and scatter their families in the name of progress. Back then, the town had united under silence and survived. Now, he said, they would do the same again. No one would question the boy's parentage. No one would mention his uncanny features. If anyone asked, he was to be spoken of as Clara's nephew, an orphan taken in from a distant cousin. Lies became their shield, and silence their ritual. But silence has a way of breeding its own monsters. The more they refused to speak, the louder their fears became. Mothers scolded their children for staring too long at the boy. Men turned away when Clara walked past, their faces tight with something that looked like guilt. The preacher himself began to change, his sermons shifting from scripture to warnings about purity, blood, and the dangers of temptation. He spoke as if trying to convince himself that their sin could be hidden if only no one dared to name it. The townsfolk followed his command, but not out of faith. They did it because they knew what silence meant in that place. It meant safety from the world outside, from the judgment of strangers, from the kind of attention that could destroy them all. So they built their walls higher, spoke their prayers quieter, and taught their children that questions were dangerous things. The boy grew up never understanding why people looked at him like a shadow. The preacher's pact had worked, the truth was buried. But in that silence, something began to fester, and it would not stay buried forever. As the boy grew older, the truth of his blood began to show not just in whispers, but in his very face. He was a living mirror of every generation that came before him, a blend so condensed it defied reason. His eyes were a strange pale grey, flecked with gold, the same color his mother's had been, but sharper, colder, as if something ancient peered through them. His nose and jaw carried the exact shape of his grandfather, and his smile, when he dared to smile, was unnervingly identical to Clara's. To anyone who looked too closely, it was impossible to tell where one bloodline ended and another began. It was all the same circle, spinning tighter with each generation. The townsfolk avoided his gaze, not because he was cruel, but because his very existence felt unnatural, like the earth had made a mistake it couldn't take back. He rarely left the farmhouse except to fetch water or gather supplies. When he did, People would stop what they were doing and watch him in silence. Conversations died mid-sentence. The store clerk would keep his eyes fixed on the counter, never meeting the boy's stare for more than a second. It wasn't hatred, it was fear, the quiet kind that seeps into your bones when you realize you're looking at something that shouldn't exist. The preacher called him a reminder, though he never said of what. The children called him the mirror boy, whispering that if you stared at him too long, you'd see your own sins reflected back. Inside the farmhouse, Clara tried to pretend everything was normal. She made him read from old books, taught him how to mend fences and light fires, but even in those quiet moments, the air between them felt thick with unspoken dread. Sometimes, at night, she would wake to find him standing by her bed, his face half-lit by the moonlight, his expression unreadable. He would ask her questions she couldn't answer about his father, about where he came from, about why people in town looked at him the way they did. She would lie every time, her voice trembling under the weight of what she couldn't say. Over the years, the boy's resemblance to her father grew stronger, almost mocking her. It was as if time itself was looping, dragging her back into the same sin she thought she'd escaped. By the time he turned 15, even the preacher avoided him. People began to whisper again, this time in fear of what he might become. The boy wasn't just a reflection anymore, he was the living proof that the past never really dies. By the time the boy reached his late teens, the bond between him and his mother had grown into something that unsettled even those who tried to ignore it. In a town where secrets were currency, theirs was the most valuable and the most dangerous. They lived in near isolation, cut off from everyone except the preacher, who visited once a month to deliver supplies and remind Clara of the sin she was born into. But each time he came, he found it harder to look the boy in the eyes. There was something in that house that went beyond guilt or shame, something that hummed like a warning under every word they spoke. The boy had grown tall, his shoulders broad like the men before him, his face so eerily similar to his grandfather that Clara sometimes froze when he entered a room. He reminded her of a time she had tried to forget, of a love that had twisted into ruin. Yet she couldn't deny how close they had become. They ate together in silence, their conversations sparse but heavy with unspoken understanding. On stormy nights, when the wind rattled the old windows, they would sit beside the fire, their hands brushing by accident, neither one pulling away. To an outsider, it might have seemed like a mother clinging to her child out of fear of being alone. But to those who saw them, the few who dared to, it felt like something else entirely. The preacher was the first to notice the change. During one visit, he saw the boy's hand resting on Clara's shoulder, lingering there too long, too familiarly. When he spoke to them, the boy's voice carried an authority that made the preacher's heart turn cold. It was as if he wasn't talking to a child anymore, but to a man claiming something that wasn't his to claim. The preacher warned Clara that their closeness would bring damnation upon them all, that some sins didn't die with time, they only learned to hide better. But she could only nod, unable to promise what she knew she could not stop. That night, as thunder rolled through the valley, Clara sat awake, listening to the boy breathe in the next room. There was no line between love and fear anymore, no difference between comfort and danger. She had tried to raise him as her son, but the world they lived in had erased the boundaries that made sense of right and wrong. And though she prayed for strength, deep down she knew that whatever bound them together had already crossed a point where prayers could no longer reach. It happened one night when the air felt too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The town had long stopped paying attention to what went on in that farmhouse at the edge of the woods, but the preacher still visited, carrying food and warnings neither of them wanted to hear. That day, his words had been harsher than ever. He told Clara that the boy was no longer her child in spirit, that what they were becoming was a stain too deep to wash away. Clara didn't answer. She only stood by the window, staring at the forest beyond, reflection in the glass blending with her son's as he stood behind her. When the preacher left, the boy locked the door behind him and blew out the candles one by one until only the fire remained. That night, something broke between them, or perhaps something that had been waiting finally took its form. The boy spoke softly, his words carrying both love and defiance, telling her that he was tired of hiding, tired of pretending that what tied them together was shame. He said he belonged to her in every way, that their blood was one, that no man could judge what God himself had allowed to continue through generations. Clara tried to turn away, But his voice followed her, calm and certain, like a prophecy she could no longer escape. Outside, the storm began to rise, the rain pounding against the roof like fists demanding entry. By midnight, the church bell rang once, a sound that made no sense, since no one was there to ring it. And in the flickering light of the fire, Clara and her son stood before the old wooden cross that had hung above their mantel for years. There were no witnesses, no vows spoken in public, but the act itself was a binding, an unholy imitation of something sacred. He took her hand, placed a ring that once belonged to her father onto her finger, and whispered that now she could never leave him. Somewhere deep inside, Clara wanted to scream, but the silence of the house swallowed every sound. When dawn came, the storm had passed. The preacher, drawn by a feeling he couldn't explain, returned to the farmhouse and saw the church's candle still burning. Through the cracked door, he caught a glimpse of them kneeling together before the cross, their hands clasped as if in prayer. He knew then what had happened, and he knew the town would never speak of it. The ceremony had no name, no witnesses, but its echo would live forever in the valley that had already forgotten how to tell the truth. Months passed after that night, and the farmhouse seemed swallowed by an eerie calm. The townsfolk rarely saw Clara anymore, and when they did, her once bright face looked hollow, her eyes sunk deep into shadows that never left her. The boy, now a man in body and manner, was seen only at dusk, walking the perimeter of their land like a guardian of something he couldn't let go. Then, one cold winter morning, the silence broke. A sound carried through the hills, the kind that made animals stop and men cross themselves. It was the cry of a newborn. Those who heard it swore it didn't sound right, like the wail of something caught between life and death. Clara had gone into labor without warning. No one came to help her this time, not even the preacher. He had vowed never to step into that house again after what he had seen. The boy delivered the child himself, his trembling hands stained with blood as the storm raged outside. When it was over, the air in the room grew still. The baby's cry came weak and broken, and when Clara looked down at her child, her breath caught in her throat. Its skin was ghostly pale, its limbs too thin, its eyes clouded as if it had been born already tired of the world. There was something about the baby that felt ancient, as though it carried the weight of every sin that had birthed it. The midwife who lived 3 miles away was summoned the next morning, but by the time she arrived, the baby was wrapped tightly in blankets, its face hidden. Clara sat motionless in a rocking chair, humming a song that no one recognized. The boy stood by the door, silent, staring at the woman with eyes that made her shiver. When she finally peeled back the blanket, her breath hitched. The infant's features were a grotesque reflection of both parents, the bloodline twisted into something the human mind wasn't meant to comprehend. The midwife fled that house before the sun set, muttering prayers all the way back to her home. 2 days later, she vanished. Her cabin was found empty, her belongings untouched, her bed still warm. Some said she ran from what she'd seen. Others whispered that the boy had gone after her when he realized she couldn't keep her silence. The truth was never written down, but one thing became certain: no one in the valley mentioned the child again. The cries that had once echoed through the hills stopped as suddenly as they had begun, leaving behind a silence far heavier than before. The disappearance of the midwife was the first crack in the town's fragile wall of silence, and it didn't go unnoticed. A few months later, a government census worker arrived in the region, tasked with documenting rural populations for a new state initiative. He was a polite man from Washington, unaccustomed to the tension that seemed to hang in the mountain air. When he reached the nearest neighboring town, he noticed something strange in the old records: a gap. There was a community listed decades earlier, one that appeared on maps until the 1950s, but had since vanished without explanation. The town's name was scratched out in ink, as though someone had tried to erase it from history. That absence bothered him, and against the warnings of locals, he decided to go find it. The road leading into the valley was nearly impassable. Trees had reclaimed the path, and the silence deepened with every turn. By the time he arrived, the sun was sinking, and what he saw didn't resemble a living town. The houses leaned like weary men, the fields were overgrown, and the smell of damp wood filled the air. Still, he knocked on doors, introducing himself, asking questions about family names, population, births, and deaths. The people he met were polite enough, but they all had the same unsettling calm, the same pale eyes that didn't quite meet his. He began to notice something else too, the names. Every record he took, every gravestone he read, every signature he saw, was the same two surnames repeating over and over again. The line between cousin, sibling, and parent blurred into something that made his stomach twist. When he reached the farmhouse at the end of the road, the one half swallowed by ivy and shadow, a woman answered the door. She looked too young to have such tired eyes. Behind her stood a man whose expression was void of warmth, his gaze sharp and cold. The census worker asked simple questions: how many people lived in the home, whether there were any children, whether they had family in other towns. The woman hesitated before answering, glancing at the man as if for permission. That hesitation was all it took to confirm that something in this place was wrong. He returned to his car at dusk, uneasy but determined to file his report. Days later, his office received his notes, lists of repeated surnames, strange gaps in lineage, and a final line scrawled in haste: "This town shouldn't exist." Not long after, federal agents were dispatched to investigate the region, but by the time they arrived, most of the homes were empty, the church door was open, and the valley seemed to have swallowed its own people whole. The night before the agents arrived, a thick fog rolled down from the mountains, blanketing the valley in silence. The few remaining townsfolk sensed something coming, a reckoning, perhaps, or the end of what little peace they had left. In the farmhouse, Clara sat by the window, her child asleep in her arms, while her son moved restlessly through the rooms like a man haunted by invisible chains. The government men were on their way, and everyone knew that once outsiders stepped onto their land, the truth could no longer be hidden. That night, the preacher visited one last time. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he warned them that judgment had finally found its path through the hills. He begged them to repent, to leave, to destroy what should never have been born. But Clara only stared at him, her voice soft and detached, saying that it was too late to run from what lived in their blood. As the preacher left, lightning cracked through the sky, illuminating the house in a single blinding flash. Rain began to fall, heavy, relentless, as if the heavens themselves were trying to drown the valley clean. The boy moved through the dark, gathering oil lamps, wood, and something else that glistened faintly in his hand. The preacher, halfway down the hill, turned back once and saw a faint glow flickering in the window. He didn't return. Within an hour, the fire had started. It spread fast, faster than any natural blaze should have, licking up the dry wood and devouring the old walls with a hunger that seemed almost alive. The smoke curled into the sky like a black wound, and the flames painted the valley in shades of gold and red. The church bell began to ring again, though no one was there to ring it. Those who watched from afar said they heard screams at first, then silence, and finally the faint sound of a lullaby carried through the wind. By dawn, nothing was left but ashes and the skeletal remains of a house that had once held too many secrets. When the agents arrived later that day, they found the valley empty. The church was abandoned, the graveyard freshly disturbed, and the farmhouse a smoldering ruin. The official report listed several deaths: Clara, her son, and a child presumed lost in the fire. No bodies were ever recovered, only fragments of jewelry and a melted ring that once belonged to Clara's father. The case was quietly closed, filed under accidental fire, but those who lived nearby swore they still saw smoke rising from the hills long after, as if the house refused to die. Years passed, and the story of the burned farmhouse faded into rumor, a ghost tale whispered by locals to frighten. The valley grew silent again, reclaimed by vines and rain, until even the roads that led there disappeared beneath the earth. The government closed the file and buried it deep within forgotten archives, sealing the names of the dead and declaring the town uninhabited. But silence never lasts forever, and the past never truly stays buried. Decades later, far from those mountains, a young man living in a southern city took a DNA test for reasons that seemed innocent enough. He was tracing his family roots, curious about where he came from. What he found instead was something that made him question who he was entirely. The results were flagged by the testing company as an anomaly, a genetic pattern so rare it defied classification. His DNA was so heavily condensed within itself that it appeared more inbred than any documented case in medical history. The markers revealed generations of interrelation, a genetic spiral that could only come from complete isolation. When the lab contacted him for verification, he thought it was a mistake. But when they traced his lineage through fragmented records and old census data, one name surfaced again and again, the town that was supposed to have been erased. Curiosity turned to obsession. He began searching through public archives, finding pieces of the story others had tried to destroy. Newspaper clippings half-burned at the edges, a preacher's journal filled with warnings, a single blurred photograph of a house engulfed in flames. The deeper he dug, the more the truth clawed its way out. He learned about Clara, about her son, about the child that vanished. The blood in his veins began to feel heavier, colder. Every reflection in the mirror felt like looking at someone he didn't recognize, someone older, someone watching. Doctors who examined him were unsettled by his features, symmetrical yet unnatural, his eyes mismatched in color, his pulse slower than normal. They said his genetic structure shouldn't exist in a living human, that his body was an echo of something long extinct. Late at night, he began hearing things, faint voices that called his name, whispers that carried through the static of old recordings. When he finally visited the ruins of the town, guided by what little remained of the old road, he found nothing but the outline of the farmhouse buried beneath the moss. Yet as he stood there, he felt something stir beneath the ground, a pull, like recognition. The story the world tried to forget had survived, not in words, but in blood, and it was still alive within him.